Welcome to the GSMC Car Podcast, the show that takes you on a journey to the automotive world. We talk about the latest news, from new makes and models to new technology to all of the must-have options available. Whether you're a fan of the old classics, love the latest models and technology, or have never met a vehicle you didn't want to work on, the GSMC Car Podcast has something for every car enthusiast.
Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Car Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, David Lucy Mabel. Okay, folks, today we are going to be talking about the latest topic in the car world that's been all the buzz for about the past week. Jeep has officially announced the 2021 Jeep Grand Wagoneer. That is right, folks. Chrysler is bringing back the Jeep Grand Wagoneer after 29 long years since 1991 when the original Wagoneer went off the market. It is finally back in all of its modern glory. And I don't get excited over Chrysler products ever, but I am excited about this one. I am excited. I'm stoked. I'm pumped. Say whatever you want to say. Today we're going to be discussing the new Jeep Grand Wagoneer, what we know so far. We're going to be discussing the competitors, and let me tell you, there is a ton of competitors in the full-size luxury SUV market. And we are going to be talking about the long and storied history of the Grand Wagoneer, how it was basically the first luxury SUV ever to hit the market way back in the 1960s when the term SUV really hadn't even been coined yet. And I will obviously tell you my thoughts on the Jeep Grand Wagoneer, and if you stay tuned, you'll get to hear that at the end of the podcast in segment 4. So let's get started. Okay, what do we know about the new Jeep Grand Wagoneer? Let me take a look over here. So, we know that it's back after 29 years. We know that. This seems to be a trend in the car industry for the past, 10 years or so, bringing back old famous nameplates. I mean, GM brought back the Camaro. Granted, the Camaro wasn't gone for an extremely long amount of time. Dodge brought back the Charger and the Challenger. Ford just recently brought back a Bronco. And Jeep is bringing back the Wagoneer. There are others that, other nameplates that have been revived. It seems to be the thing to go back, take old nameplates out of the hat and, put them back on. And I believe that is a wise marketing strategy because the Grand Wagoneer is not been gone for that long for people to not remember it. It's not like it was some obscure nameplate that was from like 40 years ago that nobody alive today is going to remember or what. No. This is the legendary Grand Wagoneer that they are bringing back. This is the real deal, folks. This is not a joke. Chrysler has finally done something great. If you all remember when I was talking about the Chrysler Pacifica, about how that was Chrysler's last attempt to stay relevant, whereas the Chrysler mark under Fiat Chrysler is really reaching the end of its time. Jeep and Dodge have been going along relatively fine. I mean, like, how fine can Chrysler products actually be? But of all the things that FCA has done, Fiat Chrysler Automobiles, bringing back the Jeep Grand Wagoneer is probably the best decision that they've made. And you will hear me say Wagoneer and Grand Wagoneer. I will use the terms interchangeably. A Grand Wagoneer for this generation of the Wagoneer will be the upscale model, and Wagoneer will be the base model. But they've been referred to as Wagoneer, Grand Wagoneer interchangeably for years now. So I will be using those terms interchangeably just to let you all know. So we have new modern styling. The Grand Wagoneer of 2021, at least that's when it's projected to start, going into production, is not retro. Now, this is sort of odd because when you think all of those cars that I mentioned that car companies have brought back, have revived old nameplates, the Camaro wasn't an evolution of the previous Camaro. It was a retro design that dated back to the Camaros of the 60s and the 70s. The Dodge Challenger was the same way. The Dodge Charger wasn't, however. The Dodge Charger wasn't, but the Bronco is. The Wrangler wasn't brought back, but the Wrangler is a retro SUV, and the Grand Wagoneer isn't. It's not retro. I believe it captures the essence of what the Grand Wagoneer always was. It was a top-of-the-line luxury SUV, and it captures the same essence, but in 2021 or in 2020, as it is right now, in 2020 styling. This is going to be a problem for some people. For me personally, it's not a problem, but the fact that it's not retro styled is going to be a problem for some people, but you will hear about that later on in the podcast. Let's see, what else do we have? It has tons of latest technology, including 7 interior screens that fulfill various functions. I believe there was an interior screen for the gauge cluster, obviously, interior screens for the center stack, interior screens for the center stack for the rear, like middle row passengers, and interior screens on each of the headrests. I believe we're at like 5 so far. And then there was another screen somewhere else, and then there was a screen on the passenger side of the dashboard, which I thought was really interesting. And I didn't know that until Doug DeMuro pointed it out in his video about his thoughts of the Grand Wagoneer. I think 7 screens is excessive. But 7 screens is definitely screaming latest technology and latest luxury. So if they want to do it, by all means, go ahead. Now, mind you, this is still in the concept stage. It is called the Grand Wagoneer Concept. So it's probably not going to change much from the concept into production, but there might be a little bit of changes. And one of those changes, you might see one of the screens or 7 of the screens, depending, they might not all be there. So that's just keeping that in mind. And also keep in mind that it is the Grand Wagoneer concept, not the Wagoneer. The Wagoneer obviously will be more stripped down because it will be the base model that starts at a significantly lower price than the Grand Wagoneer, which is the luxury model. This makes the Grand Wagoneer in the ranks of Lincoln with the Navigator, in the ranks of Cadillac with the Escalade, in the ranks of so many more. Now, think of it. When the Wagoneer came out in 1963, it didn't really have any luxury SUV competitors because there was no such thing as a luxury SUV. And even when it went out in 1991, the only luxury SUV really that was on the market was the Range Rover. It wasn't until 97 or 98 that Lincoln and Cadillac came out with the Navigator and the Escalade respectively. And I believe the Yukon Denali came around that time too. So luxury SUVs didn't really exist. I mean, you had some smaller SUVs from Mercedes-Benz in the late 90s, early 2000s that were luxurious. I think of the G-Wagon as well, but those didn't come until 10 years after the Grand Wagoneer had already lived and died. I mean, the Grand Wagoneer did not compete against luxury SUVs. Now, in the years that it's been gone, in 29 years, even though at one point it was the only luxury SUV on the market, now it's been accompanied by so many others. So competition is stiff, but it's basically in the price range of all the others, as you will soon see. This is a very good move on Chrysler's part. They desperately needed a full-size SUV. The only SUV that I can think of that was even close to full-size from any of the Chrysler marques is probably the Dodge Durango, which the Dodge Durango is not considered a full-size SUV. This has been Jeep's first full-size SUV after the flop that was the Commander in 2005 to 2010. The Commander was plagued by classic reliability issues and just cheap quality. Cheap interior plastic. I mean, it was lackluster. There was nothing great about it. The unveiling has been delayed several times since Chrysler first mentioned a Wagoneer revival in 2013. So here we are. We are in 2020. It's been 7 years since there have been rumors floating around. When is Chrysler going to bring back the Grand Wagoneer for Jeep? Blah, blah, blah. It was delayed because they wanted to make room for the Durango. It was delayed because of this. And the most recent delay has been because of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has had a hand in literally every single aspect of life. So the car industry is no different. Chrysler is relying on name recognition to draw in sales away from Ford and GM's full-size SUVs. The Suburban, the Yukon, the Escalade, the Expedition, and the Navigator. The last two being from Ford, obviously, the Ford Expedition and the Lincoln Navigator. This is a good idea. This is a good idea indeed. Even though it is not retro like the old Wagon, or it doesn't look like the old Wagoneer, the fact that they're naming it Wagoneer and Grand Wagoneer is going to draw some interest. It's going to bring some sales. This is where I think it will suffer, however. It is a Chrysler product at the end of the day. It is still a Chrysler product. I mean, I don't know if it's going to sell as well as those who have become established in the last 29 years. I mean, we're talking about almost a third of a century. Give or take, a third of a century is 33, 34 years. Here we are, we have a vehicle that hasn't been on the market in almost 30 years. The newest Grand Wagoneer before this, not counting the upscale models of the Jeep Grand Cherokee, the newest real Wagoneer before this is 29 years old. Let that sink in. I mean, granted, there are people like wagon masters in, I think, in the south of the United States, like Texas or something, that are taking old Wagoneers, refurbishing them, restoring them to brand new condition and selling them for like $100,000. But like, those are still old Wagoneers. These are not new Wagoneers. The newest Wagoneer is 29 years old. So in the past 29 years, you obviously have had some brands who have made luxury SUVs, who have made full-size SUVs, and they've cemented their place. They were once saplings and now they are full-grown trees. I mean, it might be difficult for Chrysler to come back with this right now. I mean, I don't know how they're going to do it, but let's talk mechanicals. It will be based on the Ram truck platform. So think of your regular Ram 1500 pickup truck. It is a true SUV. That being said, it is built on a body-on-frame construction built on a truck chassis. So this will be good. This will be good, especially considering that it's going to be competing with other truck-based SUVs. May have the same / similar engine options to the Ram. So the Ram comes with a gas V6, a diesel V6, and a Hemi V8. Whether or not those are going to be the choices in the Jeep Grand Wagoneer, it's still too early to tell. It is going to have, quote, unmatched towing capacity. That's what Jeep says. That's what Chrysler says. So we'll wait and see what happens. Maybe they might beef it up. Maybe they might put a V10 in there. Who knows? Available with air suspension and 3 different all-wheel drive systems. I'm not sure why an SUV needs 3 different all-wheel drive systems. I'm pretty sure one will just do. But air suspension is nice, especially considering that it's going to be a luxury SUV, and that's something I believe all of the other competitors either offer or have standard, especially when you go into the German rivals. Comfort in the interior. Of course, leather wrapped, their classic leather, your classic, nice wood trim, maybe stainless steel trim. I don't know what they're going for nowadays, but it's going to have a full glass roof. I'm not sure if the Wagoneer will have that, but the Grand Wagoneer, as far as the concept goes, is brought to us with a full glass roof, and it has seating for 7. So 2 bucket seats in the front, 2 captain seats in the middle, and 3 seats in the back on a regular bench seat. So that's going to seat 7 people. That is a proper SUV. That is a proper family vehicle. And you will definitely see, once these things become available for the market, you will definitely see upper middle class suburban mothers driving their children to soccer practice in these Grand Wagoneers, just like they did 30 years ago with the last Wagoneer. This is super exciting. There are no performance specs yet, but I have a feeling people who are going to be buying the Grand Wagoneer anyway are not going to care about performance. They're not going to care about 0 to 60 times, how fast it goes around the Nürburgring. They ain't going to care about foolishness like that, because frankly, that's not the market that they're going for. Just before we go off to the next go off into the break and into the next segment, I want to say I am genuinely excited for this. I'm not saying this because I feel bad for Chrysler, and I should probably say something good about them in one of these podcasts, because I haven't really said anything good about them. I'm actually genuinely excited for this. So please stay tuned. We're going to be discussing the numerous rivals that the Jeep Grand Wagoneer is going to face. And if you stay tuned till the very end, you will hear my actual personal thoughts on what I think of it. So please stay tuned, folks.
Are you a business owner? Someone interested in the latest news that might affect your business? Then check out the GSMC Business News Podcast, a show dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning business, technology, and the stock market. Get a head start on the day as we keep you updated on the latest goings-on Wall Street, money, jobs, and technology. The GSMC Business News Podcast has you covered.
Okay, welcome back, fellow car people and car lovers alike. Now we have reached segment 2 in the podcast. So we are going to be discussing the competitors and the pricing of the Jeep Grand Wagoneer. We are going to first start out with the fact that the Wagoneer is the descendant of the original luxury SUV, the new Wagoneer, that is. It has been gone for 29 years, and others have taken its place. And here are the ones that have come to take its place. We're going to start out with the competitors of the Jeep Grand Wagoneer, which is the luxury model. The Grand Wagoneer is said so far to is going to have an MSRP of $75,000. That's going to be the I guess the starting price of the upscale version. And I've even heard rumors that it's going to be optioned up to $100,000, which, if I'm not mistaken, will make it the most expensive Jeep ever offered on the market. That's kind of crazy to think of a $100,000 Jeep. That is quite something. I think they'll be able to pull it off, though. I think they'll be able to pull it off. I think you will find people who will shell out $100,000 for a Jeep Grand Wagoneer, depending on if it's good or not, because we know Chrysler reliability is a problem. Though the Wagoneer is a Jeep product, it will be competing with some big names. For example, Mercedes-Benz GLS class. This is the top-of-the-line traditional SUV from Mercedes-Benz. I believe it's built on a truck platform. Don't quote me on that, however, because I don't know too much about Mercedes-Benz. It starts out at $75,950. And of course, with Mercedes-Benz, you're going to get it optioned up to probably $130,000, $140,000 because you're going to have the AMG model and whatnot. But of course, the AMG models are going to be competing in a class of their own. They're not going to be competing against the, American Jeep Grand Wagoneer from Chrysler. You're going to have the BMW X7. BMW X7, once again, full-size luxury SUV. Seating for 3 rows of seats. Starts out at $73,900. So far, we find that the Jeep Grand Wagoneer is actually more expensive than the 2020 BMW X7. In what world did we ever think that a Jeep would be more expensive than a BMW? But you know what, folks? It's 2020. I mean, everything that seemed to not be able to happen is happening this year, including a Jeep that is more expensive than a BMW. We have the Cadillac Escalade that starts out at $75,195. This is basically the same price as a Grand Wagoneer. I'm not sure what the dimensions are, but I'm pretty sure the Cadillac Escalade is significantly larger than the Jeep Grand Wagoneer. But of course, I don't know what the dimensions are. Those numbers haven't come out yet. But the Cadillac Escalade is like something ridiculous. It's like 17 and a half feet long. Of course, in the old days, that wasn't anything, but nowadays, 17 and a half feet long is quite something. The Lincoln Navigator starts out at $76,185. This is, I want to say something about the Lincoln Navigator. Ford has stepped up its game so much in the past 5, 6, 7 years. I honestly, I almost think that the Lincoln Navigator is better than the new Cadillac Escalade, frankly. I don't have any basis to say that on, but based on just what I've seen from Ford and the fact that Cadillac is kind of playing games now because they're half wanting to compete against Lincoln, half wanting to compete against Mercedes-Benz, they really haven't committed. I think the Lincoln Navigator is really doing itself well. And frankly, I think I see, they're not as common as the Cadillacs. So, maybe the Cadillacs might sell more, but maybe it's the people who know what they really want that are going for the Lincoln Navigator. So I think this will be a stiff competition against the Grand Wagoneer. I think it's going to be hard to get people to not buy the Lincoln Navigator in favor of the Grand Wagoneer. Maybe because the fact that the Grand Wagoneer will have off-road capability just as its ancestor, people who want off-road capability will probably not go for the Lincoln or the Cadillac or the, Mercedes-Benz or really any of them don't really have much off-road credentials except the Toyota Land Cruiser, but we haven't gotten there yet. So, the Lincoln is going to be some stiff competition for the Jeep, especially that it's American too. You've got the GMC Yukon Denali. GMC Yukon is not a luxury SUV, but the Yukon Denali is basically a baby Escalade. I mean, it's the same size. It's not as luxurious as an Escalade, and it shares, a lesser nameplate, but the Yukon Denali is still a tried and true luxury SUV. It's just not as expensive as, say, the Cadillac Escalade. That starts out at $67,700, I should say. Then you have the Lexus LX. We just talked about the German and the American rivals. We have not even spoken about what Japan has to offer. The Lexus LX is a huge deal. It is very expensive. It's more expensive than the offerings from Mercedes-Benz and BMW. The Lexus LX starts out at $86,480. I will probably say that the people who are going to be buying Lexus LXs are not going to be the same people that are looking at a Jeep Grand Wagoneer. I believe the price disparity is that different that they don't really occupy the same market. Nonetheless, because it has not been a formal market gap, like it's not, I guess, it doesn't formally belong to another market. It still belongs in the full-size luxury SUV market. I have left the Lexus LX on the list, but I don't think they will be directly competing against each other. The Jeep Grand Wagoneer mostly has to worry about American rivals, maybe a German rival or two. The Toyota Land Cruiser, $85,415. The reason why I say the Lexus LX is not really a threat to the Wagoneer, but the Toyota Land Cruiser might be, even though the Land Cruiser is really crawling in terms of sales. The Land Cruiser, in terms of capability, is probably the most similar to the Grand Wagoneer, at least the way that Chrysler presented it. They presented it as being able to go off-road and having serious off-road credibility. The Toyota Land Cruiser, even though it has grown massive in size, and we tend to think of off-roaders as being more light and nimble, the Toyota Land Cruiser still has serious off-road capability and potential. It's still rugged like the Toyota Land Cruisers of old. So in terms of pure performance off-road and ability and things of that sort, I think this is probably the closest to the Grand Wagoneer on the list. And we have to think Jeep historically competed against Land Cruisers anyway. So it would only make sense that the modern renditions of both of them would compete against each other. Now we're going to be talking about competition for the Wagoneer. The Wagoneer starts out at $60,000. We have a Chevy Suburban. Chevy Suburbans start out at $51,700. The Chevy Suburban is the longest running nameplate of any GM product. They've been making the Suburban since fiddlesticks, probably since the 1930s. I mean, this car has been around for a while. Started out as a station wagon, grew into an SUV, and it's just stayed there since. And it doesn't appear that it's going anywhere anytime soon. The Ford Expedition. The Ford Expedition starts out at $52,810. Built on the same platform as the Lincoln Navigator. Obviously, there's a Ford Expedition Platinum Edition, which is a luxury SUV, not as luxurious as a Navigator, but still luxurious nonetheless. You got the Toyota Sequoia. I actually haven't seen a Sequoia in a while. I almost forgot to put this on the list. So there you have it. Starts out at $49,980. I don't know much about the Sequoia except the fact that it's a Toyota and it's definitely reliable. And it's also a full-size Toyota, even though they already have a full-size Toyota in the Land Cruiser, but it's the luxury version, but then they have the Lexus LX. I don't know. But moving on, we have the Nissan Armada that starts out at $47,500. And as people may realize, if you're privy to the car community, the Nissan Armada was redesigned a few years ago and built on the same platform and basically the same body style as the Nissan Patrol in overseas markets. They finally caught up to the Nissan Patrol. Here is what I think of the pricing and the competition. I'm not going to talk competition in terms of specs. I'm not going to talk competition in terms of any other thing, really, because luxury SUVs tend to be pretty much the same formula. Nobody's going to be driving a luxury SUV that's going to be a Mustang killer unless you're driving like a G63 AMG or something, and that's something ridiculous. It's not even a full-size SUV. So, yeah, I believe that the Grand Wagoneer will fit in price-wise with the luxury SUVs. But the Wagoneer, on the other hand, which is the lesser model, which is the base model, is too expensive. Yeah, it's too expensive. And let me just put that into perspective. It's too expensive when compared with the non-luxury full-size SUVs. The cheapest full-size SUV is the Armada. It is nearly $13,000 cheaper starting out than the Grand Wagoneer, or than the Wagoneer, I should say. Why is the Wagoneer so expensive? I'm hoping because it's a concept and it hasn't actually gone into production that the numbers will slightly shift, but that seems too expensive for a Chrysler product. Especially a Chrysler product that's just starting out again, that hasn't been around in ages. I mean, they should really make it cheaper, the base model cheaper, so that they can draw more money away from the other companies and more customers. Because who in their right mind is going to pass up a Toyota Sequoia, which starts out at $49,980? Who in their right mind is going to pass that up for a Jeep Wagoneer? Like, I'll wait. Nobody. Because the Jeep Wagoneer is not like the Wagoneer of old. It's made by Chrysler. The Wagoneer of old was made by Chrysler Jeep. It was then made by AMC. And even when Chrysler took over it, they left it untouched. So it still had all the AMC mechanicals. It was not a cheap Chrysler product that was going to break down within 3 years of you buying it brand new. I mean, this is the legacy that the Wagoneer has to live up to. And the new Wagoneer, I know, is not going to live up to the legacy of the old one. And so why would anybody pass up Toyota reliability for cheaper and take Chrysler poor quality and poor reliability for, in the case of the Sequoia, for about $10,000 more? Why? There is no why. There is no reason. Chrysler's making the base model too expensive. Even the most expensive of the non-luxury full-size SUVs on this list, which is the Chevy Suburban, is about $7,000 cheaper. Or no, it's actually the Ford Expedition, sorry. The Ford Expedition is about $7,000 cheaper, and that's the most expensive of the full-size SUVs on this list that are not luxury. So what is Chrysler doing offering something that is $7,000 more expensive than the most expensive non-luxury full-size SUV? There isn't really a reason for it. So I hope that I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt that because it is a concept and hasn't actually officially gone to production yet, that the number will go down, that it will not start out at $60,000 because that price is a bit too steep. Frankly, if I were Chrysler, I'd make it start out at around $53,000 just to, not even $53,000. Heck goodness. I make it start out at probably $47,000 just to be right around the baseline so people can see that it's affordable so they can be willing to, buy it. And it will also make the Grand Wagoneer seem more appealing since it will be significantly more expensive than the lesser Wagoneer. But we'll see what happens. The Wagoneer, by virtue of being a Chrysler product, may have trouble selling. The quality and reliability issues may deter some buyers who will ultimately go for similar equipped SUVs that are cheaper and more reliable. And because the new Wagoneer is not retro or reminiscent of the old one, the name recognition will only go so far. It might as well be not called the Wagoneer because it doesn't remind anyone of the old one. That's just what I wrote down and I read it off the page literally, but yeah, that's basically what I've been saying. It's not retro. It's too expensive as far as non-luxury SUVs go. So the name recognition is only going to go so far. But those are basically my only gripes with it so far, besides, of course, poor Chrysler reliability. But I harp on that too much. You already know that Chrysler is terribly unreliable. But those are my only complaints so much. And those may not even be real complaints. As soon as we see it go into production, we see how it performs in a few years. So we'll wait and find out. In the meantime, I want you to stay tuned because in segment 3, we are going to be talking about the long and storied history of the Jeep Grand Wagoneer and how it got to be the Chrysler product that it is today. And we are going to be talking in segment 4 about my thoughts on the Jeep Grand Wagoneer and what I think of it and how I think it's going to perform. So please stay tuned after the break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Okay, welcome back, folks. The Grand Wagoneer. How did it start out? Where did it all begin? In the last segment, we spoke about the competition, but let's talk about where it actually began. How was the Wagoneer birthed? Okay, so we're going to start. Let me first tell you, the Jeep Grand Wagoneer is largely considered to be the first luxury SUV. It makes sense. Jeep invented the idea of an SUV way back in like late World War II. And so naturally, they would make the first luxury SUV as well. The Jeep Grand Wagoneer was introduced by Chrysler Jeep in 1963. Now, for those of you who don't know, Chrysler Jeep used to be called Willys Jeep, which used to be called Willys Knighton, was changed to Willys Overland, then became Willys Jeep, and became Chrysler Jeep after a while. So that company, went by several names over the years. Chrysler Jeep produced it from 1963 to 1970, and by it, I mean obviously the Jeep Wagoneer. Then AMC, American Motor Corporation, or American Motors, from 1970 to 1987, for 17 years, produced the Jeep Grand Wagoneer. And finally, Chrysler bought out AMC in 1987, and for the last 4 years of its run, it was a Chrysler product from 87 to 91. So basically, when we think of the old Jeep Grand Wagoneer, we can safely say most of them were AMC products because they were produced by AMC for 17 years. So yeah, let's just see what that 29 production year run ended up serving for the Grand Wagoneer and how it ended up serving luxury SUVs of today in a frankly very direct manner as far as philosophy goes, on the philosophy in which they build it. The Grand Wagoneer had a 29-year production run with only one generation, with several facelifts and updates over the years. Never a full redesign. So that means 2021 will be the first time a fully redesigned Grand Wagoneer will be on the market. From 1963 to 1991, the platform didn't change. They only changed cosmetics on the outside and the interior, obviously, and did some facelifts and maybe different engine options over the year. But the car itself never really changed, much like the Toyota Century, how the Toyota Century never changed, really. That's basically what the Grand Wagoneer was like. So this is sort of jarring. The fact that it disappears for 29 years and all of a sudden it's come back, it's reached nirvana, it's reached enlightenment, it's modern, it's new age, it's thinking for itself, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it's a bit jarring having the, Wagoneer come back completely new and not even looking like the old one. This makes the Wagoneer the third longest single generation car in U.S. history. Don't ask me what the other ones are. I don't know, but that is a title. I mean, that's not very often you hear that. Car companies typically change their models and facelift them and generationalize them or whatever, create a new generation every 5 or 6 years. So the fact that this went 29 years basically unchanged is rather impressive. It is truly the first of its kind. At least when it came back in 1963. It succeeded the Willys Jeep station wagon that was also built on a truck chassis. So if we really want to take it way back, we would talk about the Willys Jeep station wagon, but that wasn't quite SUV-like. That was more of an off-roady type wagon because it was built on a truck platform. But nonetheless, it preceded the Jeep Grand Wagoneer. It has independent front suspension. Now, let's just think about what SUVs and trucks and off-road vehicles were like back in those days. They were very Spartan. Spartan meaning very stripped down, no frills about them. They were basically a body, 4 wheels, some seats, and a steering wheel. That was it. There wasn't things like air conditioning. There weren't things like automatic transmissions, none of your creature comforts really, because they were work vehicles. People didn't choose these vehicles as their, family haulers. This is not what an SUV was at the time, the early SUVs. If you wanted a family car in those days, you got a station wagon. Station wagons were just as luxurious as automobiles, as cars, I should say. They're all automobiles as cars. But an SUV, that was a work vehicle. A pickup truck, that was a work vehicle. There was no such thing as luxury pickup trucks. There was no such thing as luxury SUVs. So the fact that the Jeep Grand Wagoneer had independent front suspension, which made the handling similar to that of a car. It had power steering. It had an automatic transmission. It had factory radio and optional air conditioning back in 1963, people. 1963, where your next SUV was basically a four on the floor and a bench seat and, some metal around you. I mean, that was it. These things, this slew of features had never before been heard of in the automotive community as far as 4x4 vehicles. It was ludicrous. It was ludicrous thinking that, oh my gosh, a luxury 4x4, what is that? But let me tell you, as crazy as it sounded, it worked. And it worked very well because these things far outsold any other vehicle in this segment, because these were the only ones that were comfortable and enjoyable to drive. All the other ones sucked, frankly. I mean, this was a brilliant idea that Chrysler Jeep had. And this was basically the great granddaddy of all your luxury SUVs today. I'm talking about the lowliest of the Chevy Suburbans with leather seats to the mightiest of the Rolls-Royce Cullinans. I mean, this is the granddaddy of all luxury SUVs. There would not be a luxury SUV if it were not for the Jeep Grand Wagoneer. The concept simply did not exist. So if you today can drive a Bentley Bentayga, a Rolls-Royce Cullinan, a Mercedes-Benz G-Wagon, I mean, you have the Grand Wagoneer to thank for all of that, because these cars may have existed, but they may have existed in a completely different form if Jeep at the time, Chrysler Jeep, didn't marry the idea of luxury and off-road capability in the Jeep Grand Wagoneer. Moving on. This debuted, oh pardon me goodness, debuted 7 years before the Range Rover. The Range Rover was basically the English equivalent of this. It debuted 18 years before the Range Rover ever had a four-door version. And it debuted 24 years before the Range Rover, with its four-door version, ever came to the United States. So think of it. For 24 years, the Jeep Grand Wagoneer was the cream of the crop, was the luxury SUV. Whereas there probably weren't others. There were probably SUVs that had more creature comforts as the years went by. But this was the luxury SUV that your rich and snotty families in California would be driving. I mean, this was a big deal, folks. This was a big deal. Before there was a Grand Wagoneer, there was a Super Wagoneer that came out in 1966 and ended in 1969. This version of the Wagoneer, the Super Wagoneer, is largely considered where luxury SUVs began. They made less than 4,000 of them, so it would probably be super rare to find a Super Wagoneer nowadays as opposed to a Grand Wagoneer. But I thought I should let that tidbit in there. In 1970, AMC acquired Chrysler Jeep, and they made changes to the Wagoneer. They refined the manufacturing process, which made it more affordable. They changed the grille to a plastic egg crate style grille, and they gave it a new V8 engine to replace the Buick engine that originally powered the Wagoneer. That's actually kind of cool to think about, the fact that a Wagoneer, which is now a Chrysler product, had a Buick engine. Who knows? Fun fact for you all. In 1984, the name Wagoneer Limited was given to the new XJ Cherokee's upscale trim level. So the Cherokee, I think I mentioned it in my Ford Bronco podcast several months ago now. Goodness, it seems like forever that I've been doing this. But it was first on the SJ platform. Then AMC took over, and then the Cherokee moved down. The SJ platform is what the Grand Wagoneer was also built on. Then the Cherokee moved down to the XJ platform. So the XJ platform was a mid-size SUV, not a full-size two-door SUV like the Cherokee used to be that competed against the likes of the Ford Bronco. This was now a mid-size SUV, and the luxury version of that mid-size SUV was called the Wagoneer Limited. So as a result, the Wagoneer lost the Limited and the Brougham names, and it became Grand Wagoneer and Wagoneer Custom that didn't last for a very long time. So that's what the Wagoneer was called in order to differentiate it from the Wagoneer Limited that was actually a completely different vehicle. Let's see, what else was I going to say? In 1987, Chrysler bought AMC, but left the now antiquated SJ platform alone. They made some improvements to the Grand Wagoneer before putting it out to pasture in 1991. So basically, Chrysler came through, bought AMC, and by the time that AMC was bought out by Chrysler, they were actually thinking about replacing the SJ platform. But they never got around to it. They were bought out. Chrysler took them over. And what ended up happening was that Chrysler had other plans in mind, really. Chrysler was preoccupied with other things. I believe their minivans were coming around right around the same time. So they were probably more focused on, doing minivans and really working on the XJ Cherokee instead of worrying about the SJ platform. It was doing fine. And in those days, Chrysler left things that weren't broken and they didn't try to fix them. Nowadays, Chrysler tries to fix everything and they only make it worse. But in those days, Chrysler was actually wise. And what they did, they improved the quality of the AMC, or now the former AMC Jeep Grand Wagoneer. Which is kind of crazy. The fact that Chrysler improved quality on something instead of decreasing quality or making it worse like they do nowadays. But anyways, enough dumping on Chrysler. What they actually did, they offered a new overhead system for it. So new lights, a compass, remote keyless entry, things that, nowadays are nothing, but in those days was a big deal, especially for a luxury SUV, because the fact is the luxury SUV was still a very new concept, even after so many years that the Grand Wagoneer had been on the market. They offered different wheels, different colors, different sorts of things to make it more appealing and to keep the sales up before they finally killed it off. They killed it off in 1991. In 1993, the Grand Wagoneer nameplate reappeared on the 1993 to 1994 Jeep Grand Cherokee, which now had been was a new generation, was on the ZJ platform. This one had a V8 engine, the simulated wood grain siding. I mean, this was probably a pretty great car to have. I've ridden in those old Jeep Grand Cherokees. They were really comfortable and super reliable vehicles because, like I said, those were still built on the bones of the AMC Jeeps. These were not bona fide Chrysler pieces of junk like Chrysler has cars today. These were good vehicles. I've ridden in them. They were comfortable. They were pretty great. So yeah, the Grand Wagoneer ended in 1991. The last time we saw the nameplate was in 94. That's basically the story of the Grand Wagoneer. And now, much to everyone's delight, Jeep is bringing it back. Chrysler has told Jeep to bring it back, so they're bringing it back for 2021, and they've just announced it. So please stay tuned for the next segment in which I talk about my thoughts on the Grand Wagoneer, and yeah, you'll hear my thoughts, and please stay tuned after the break.
Do you work in the world of marketing and advertising? Are you a media buyer or the owner of an agency? Have you been looking for a podcast to help stay on top of all the goings-on of those worlds? The GSMC Marketing News Podcast is dedicated to keeping you up to date on all things concerning marketing and advertising. Get the latest marketing news, from what major businesses have planned for the coming year to the newest trends in advertising, from podcasts, digital and streaming, to the old standbys of radio, television, and billboards. The GSMC Marketing News Podcast has you covered, whether you're a marketing agent or a business trying to expand your brand.
Alrighty, folks. So, wow, I get to talk about the Wagoneer. I'm excited. I'm never excited for Chrysler products. Holy smokes, I'm never excited for Chrysler products. Every time I hear that Chrysler is coming out with something new, I tend to groan and I tend to dread. I'll be like, oh my goodness, what on earth are they going to come out with this time? But like I had said in my Bronco podcast, like I had said in my Chrysler Pacifica podcast, Chrysler needed to bring back the Jeep Grand Wagoneer, and they finally did. We've been waiting 29 years. I'm 22 years old, so that means 7 years longer than I've even been alive. We've been waiting for the next Grand Wagoneer. We, as in the car community, all of car humankind, if I could put it that. We've been waiting, and it is finally here. Here are my thoughts. It is a huge deal for Chrysler. They are finally doing something right. Boy, Chrysler hasn't done something right since the Imperial. Yeah, Chrysler hasn't done anything right since the Imperial. They might have had a few shining moments since, but nothing undoubtedly really good for them since probably the demise of the Imperial in the 70s. So the fact that Chrysler's actually doing something right, I don't know. I mean, I'm surprised that they didn't name it after the Aspen. Frankly, they instead of making it a Jeep, they made it a Chrysler, and they made the Chrysler Aspen. That's more in line with the crap that Chrysler's been doing nowadays than coming out with a Jeep Grand Wagoneer. That is a power move on Chrysler's part. I have to say, good job, Chrysler. Honestly, that is a power move because nobody expected it. I mean, people thought the rumors, but with the way Chrysler's been going, frankly, could you blame us? We had no faith that Chrysler was actually going to come out with something good, something that people actually wanted, instead of a minivan that is built on, that is built off of the legacy of a failed crossover from the early 2000s, the Pacifica. I mean, Chrysler's actually doing something great. So I'm super excited to see the new Jeep Grand Wagoneer. Here are my gripes, though, or at least this is one gripe. It's not retro. Doug DeMuro griped a lot about this in his reaction video to the Jeep Grand Wagoneer coming out. His thoughts that he heard it was coming out and he immediately put it on More Doug. You should probably go watch the video, by the way, about his thoughts on the Jeep Grand Wagoneer. The thing is, I don't necessarily agree, though. I don't agree that it has to be retro. Here's why. Jeep already has a retro SUV. That's the Wrangler. Retro styling wouldn't do the Grand Wagoneer justice in the current market for luxury SUVs. I mean, look at all the other luxury SUVs. Which one of them is retro? None. And I'm talking about the luxury full-size SUVs. The one from Mercedes-Benz isn't, even though they also have a luxury SUV that's retro, but that's a mid-size. The Ford Expedition, no. Chevy Suburban, no. Toyota Land Cruiser, no. GMC Yukon Denali, no. Cadillac Escalade, no. Lincoln Navigator, no. BMW X7, no. None of them are retro. So just because it shares the name Grand Wagoneer doesn't necessarily mean it has to be your super cliche retro automobile that's been gone for 20-something years and that they're going to bring back. Not to take a stab at the Ford Bronco, because I actually love the Ford Bronco, but that's basically what it is. It's just your cliche, retro-styled car off of a nameplate that hasn't been around forever. It's not... I don't know, it's not justifiable to gripe the fact that a luxury SUV that's going to top out at $100,000 is not retro styled. The people who are going to be buying this are not going to be the people who are worried about retro styling. Because retro styling, where do you really go from there? You've made it look old. That's great. Now what else do you do? What's the next generation going to look like? Retro styling is very restrictive in the sense that people have already expected it to look old. Now you have to keep it looking old for however long without redesigning it. And when you do redesign it, people are going to complain, blah, blah, blah. So I think Chrysler made a good move about not making it retro, because now they can update the style as they please without any pressure from the public and being like, well, it doesn't look look like the old Wagoneer, blah, blah, blah. Well, if it never looked like the old Wagoneer to begin with, then people won't worry about it. Only the people who actually love the old Wagoneers are going to worry about it. And let me tell you, that's not the majority of people who are going to be buying this. The majority of people who love old Wagoneers have old Wagoneers, and they're not willing to get rid of them. So they're not going to be buying a new Wagoneer. This is more for the current luxury SUV market. Modern luxury and design, in my opinion, capture the spirit of the old Wagoneer. It was always meant to be luxurious. The Wagoneer ushered in a completely new era of automobiles. The luxury SUV. So because it ushered it in, this was the top of the line SUV in general back in 1963. It had all sorts of technology. It had all sorts of innovations that people had never heard before in the SUV market. So the fact that the new Wagoneer has a bunch of innovations, has a bunch of technology, has a bunch of luxury that really people weren't expecting, kind of keeps with the spirit of the Wagoneer. Because when it came out in 1963, people weren't expecting it either. So, the fact that it's come out in such a form that people aren't expecting, I don't believe people need to gripe about it. I believe, it captures the essence of the old. It is a nod to the old. It is the spiritual successor to the old, and frankly, the direct successor too. It doesn't have to look old to accomplish the things that the old one did. That being said, will it live up to the legacy of the old one? Absolutely not. I'm sorry, it's not going to. If AMC was still around and able to make reliable vehicles like they did, at least relatively compared to Chrysler today, then maybe it would live up to but it's not going to. Chrysler still hasn't found its way. Fiat Chrysler automobiles haven't found their way into making reliable cars. I swear, these people must be anti-reliability or something, because I don't know, of course, how hard it is to make an automobile, because I am an automobile fanatic and enthusiast, but I don't actually know the logistics behind designing a new car, designing an engine, blah, 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 making it run, making it fit, making it cost effective to actually sell, and making it reliable. I don't know the logistics that go into it. But all I can say, they can take some tips from Ford and Chevy and actually make reliable engines. They haven't made anything reliable. All the Chrysler quality control is terrible, and you always hear about, them breaking down and whatnot, and they're always constantly being in the shop. So the fact that the old AMC Jeep Gladiator was basically untouched by Chrysler when Chrysler finally bought it, meaning that it was not tainted by any crap that Chrysler had to do. It was purely a non-Chrysler product, even when it was being produced by Chrysler. Chrysler left the original AMC V8 engine that was carbureted in the 87 to 91 model, instead of putting their arguably more modern fuel-injected V8 into it, because they felt like, look, it ain't broke, we're not going to fix it. This is not the same world that we live in today. You're going to have a Jeep Grand Cherokee, and you're going to have a Jeep Grand Wagoneer. You're going to have all these Jeep products. They're going to be giving you problems. So it's not going to live up to the legacy of old. There are still old Wagoneers being sold for $50, $60, $70, in some cases $100,000 today, because people love them that much, because they were the original luxury SUV. These will depreciate like rocks. They are not going to live up to the name. And the fact that it's not retro, ironically, even though I don't have a problem with it being not retro, the fact that it's not retro is definitely going to hurt it. It's sad, really. It's sad, really, because Chrysler's done a good job, but it's not going to live up to the legacy of the old Grand Wagoneer. And that might hurt the perception of the Wagoneer for some people, because, it's not going to. I mean, frankly, a lot of retro cars don't live up to the legacy of the old ones, especially the retro ones that are not just retro in styling, but retro in the sense that they were gone for a while and they've made a comeback. A lot of them don't live up to the hype of the old. The Ford Bronco is an exception. It really is. Ford did such a good job with that. And Jeep should still be trembling, by the way. Despite the fact that they're coming out with their own retroly named SUV. It just makes me sad, man. It's not going to live up to the legacy of the old one. However, that's not the only reason why I see problems for the future of the Wagoneer. There's too much competition. In the days when the Jeep Grand Wagoneer lived and it died, in those days, there was no competition in the luxury car market. I mean, you had Range Rover towards the end of the Chrysler, towards the end of the Jeep Grand Wagoneer's run, but that never really posed a threat to the Wagoneer. So we've got a small problem here. The problem is, it's actually not a small problem. It's a large problem. We've got like 13 competitors competing against this vehicle in both variations, the luxury variation and the base variation. So these vehicles in the past 29 years have come in, they've established themselves, they've cemented themselves. That's a huge hurdle that Jeep is going to have to get over with the Grand Wagoneer. I will say though, before I close, and before I say, I have to give Chrysler a thumbs up. The car community, the car market is rough these days. It's cutthroat. You can't just come out with anything and expect people not to critique it. I have to give Chrysler a thumbs up, however. Chrysler has done some crazy things. They haven't done very smart things, but they've done some crazy things. With their Hellcat motors, with their Dodge Demon, with all of their super duper high performance, absolutely ridiculous cars that they've made, especially under the Dodge nameplate. And of course you've got the Jeep Trackhawk too. I mean, I've got to give it to them. They have held on. They've held on, and they have truly marched to the beat of their own drum. Do I think marching to the beat of your own drum is wise when it comes to the car market? Probably not. But they have totally marched to the beat of their own drum, and I can't blame them for it. In this sense, I will say, good job, Chrysler. Don't screw it up. Please do not screw up the Grand Wagoneer. You've done great by bringing it back. You've done great at making it compete against real luxury SUVs. Not to say that this wouldn't be a real one, but real luxury SUVs from the world over, from Germany, from Japan, from right here in the States. You've made it comparable to those. Don't screw it up. Please, Chrysler, don't screw it up. That's all I can say is don't screw it up. And please, Chrysler, add the wood trim on the sides again. That will, shut the people up who think it's not retro enough. Please add the wood trim. If anybody from Chrysler is listening to me and they're on the design team for the Grand Wagoneer, please put the wood trim back on. It will be much appreciated. And all those people who think it's not retro looking enough will finally shut up. So, this is where we've gotten. We have discussed the new Grand Wagoneer, we've discussed the competition, we've discussed the history of the Grand Wagoneer, and we've discussed my personal thoughts. Overall, I think it's wonderful. I am super, super, super excited to start seeing Wagoneers on the road, and I might actually go to a Jeep dealership and check one out. I mean, just to see it, just for kicks and giggles. So I'm super excited, and I hope you all are excited too. Thank you for listening to the GSMC Car Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask you to please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review. That really helps us. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the GSMC Car Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type GSMC into your favorite podcast app to find all of the shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, from business news to weird news. Please subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you've enjoyed today's episode.